Hi everyone, Chris Green, the history chap. I'm just doing our normal Friday history update. So welcome. This is a little bit different to my normal videos that I put up, which are, well researched. A lot of work goes into them with the scripting and the filming and the editing and the images. This is just me sharing a bit of history with you, like we would if we were in the pub or meeting for a coffee or something like that. Okay, so if you're expecting lots of gizmos, I'm sorry, you might want to watch one of my prepared videos. But if you just want to have a little bit of live banter, live chat, thanks. I've got Bill, I've got QA Library. Good to see you again, as per. Doing this at 11 o'clock. 11's is, so I've got my coffee. I apologize to my American followers. Some of you might be up at this time of the morning if you're an insomniac. But on the other hand, some of my Australian friends like Alex, you might be with me today, and it gives you the opportunity to join me this side of midnight. So, and a belated Diwali. Oh wow, okay, that's cool. Adisura. Where are you coming in from, mate? Are you in India or are you somewhere else? I don't know. By all means, put it in there. Everyone, if you're watching this live Friday, just gone 11 o'clock in the morning, UK time, by all means, join in the chat. I do keep stopping. You'll see me keep looking down like this at the chat, and I will try and participate in there. Indian in India, Delhi, lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining me. So we've got so far I've got a vote from India. I'm guessing we've got one or two Brits here. Where else are people watching in from in the world? Have we got anyone from North America, Canada, or anything else? South London, not as exotic as Delhi, but nearly as strange. The Dordogne, oh, France, cool. And would you believe, I don't think I've got anything this week about the French. Shocking, hey? East Kent, lovely to see you. Rochester Castle. Oh, nice one, Buckinghamshire. So we've got the Brits on. I've got to tell you one thing. Actually, I put my new video out last night, all about the Malayan emergency. Lots of folk, not least Brits, a few Australians as well in the past, have said, would I do a talk about the Malayan emergency? What the heck was it? Because they've had relatives who are there, dads, uncles, etc., fought in the Malayan emergency. A lot of British soldiers in particular ended up there, not least doing national service. About half the men who served in Malaya were national service conscripts. And of course, I put it out last night, and that sort of ties in with American waking up times. So I've had loads of comments about, basically it was nothing like Vietnam. Vietnam was a much bigger war. The Brits, it was just a sideshow in Malaya. This morning, of course, we've flicked over. Americans have gone to bed. Brits are all waking up, and I'm getting loads of different comments about Malaya, like a great result, and lots of stuff about them, your relatives being there. So anyway, you can never please all the people all the time. But hello to everyone who's coming in. New Hampshire, USA, we have got someone from across the pond. Lovely to see you. Anyway, it's been a busy week, as I've just alluded to. I spent a fair bit of time getting the latest video up and running, and I also released that as a podcast as well. So that sort of kills two birds with one stone. I know some of you both watch my videos, but also listen into the podcasts as well when it's more convenient, when you're driving or doing exercise or walking the dog or whatever it might be. Sorry, just seeing the Black Prince comment. Thank you very much from South London. I've also been out speaking again. I'm seem to be picking up more and more speaking engagements. This one was up in the northwest of England, which was really nice. Just taken a booking, actually, first time, for the Friends of the Mercian Regiment, which is our local regiment here in Worcester. Well, actually, the Worcestershire Regiment became part of the Mercian Regiment. Actually, ironically, the Mercians were also in my old county of Cheshire. So Friends of the Mercian Regiment, I'm going to be speaking about Dad's Army in the new year. Dad's Army, their real wartime services, which of course was the basis of one of my videos that I've done here on YouTube. So there you go. So let's crack in. What happened in British history this week? Well, there's loads, and what I'm probably going to do is, if you noticed last week, the last couple of weeks, it started to get a little bit out of hand. We've been hitting the hour, which is great, but actually we've all got other things to do in life as well, and I don't want to bore the pants off you. So what I'll do, I'm going to race through them, then we'll come back and cherry pick a few. I'll ask maybe for what people think. What do I think of the Sharp novels, says David. I like the Sharp novels. Took a while for me to get into them. My dad was a massive Sharp fan. He was also a Hornblower fan. And I understand that Bernard Cornwell, when he did Sharp, he was a great fan of the Hornblower books as well. So that's why he sort of took Richard Sharp and put him in the army and followed his career. And it was a bit of a nod to the Horatio Hornblower books. Anyway, my dad was Hornblower and Sharp. I liked the Sharp novels, also like his Last Kingdom series as well. Totally different back in Anglo-Saxon England against the Vikings. But that's a great series as well. And I find that part of English history, or British history actually, very absolutely fascinating. And I would like to go back there someday and do some videos or talks about Britain in the period after the Romans through to the Norman conquest. But I appreciate there's a lot of my fans on YouTube who are like, where's the Zulus in that? So, or Gordon and the Mahdists. So I've got to sort of tread carefully that I don't alienate a lot of the people who love what I do, especially in the 19th century stuff, by going back into the depths of English history. So, and David Webbs, you put a nice one from the Isle of Wight. I'm just about to embark on researching the Pluto line that had pumping stations close. Close to Sandown in the Isle of Wight. Find the whole D-Day thing actually fascinating, not just the fighting. Because I mean, let's be honest, if you want the fighting, you go and watch Mark Felton or something, and he's got more stories in the Second World War than you can shake a stick at. But I do find D-Day was almost like a project management masterclass that no business, I don't think, has ever managed to get anywhere close to. Obviously, haven't had to, because they weren't invading another country or trying to take out the Nazis. But I find the whole thing, if you actually look at the whole build-up to D-Day, and Eisenhower, to have had a handle on everything that was going on. Obviously, he wasn't directing everything. There's a lot of people putting stuff into place. But if you look at the counter of espionage that was taking place, if you look at the training, if you look at the whole logistics, Mulberry Harbours, the Pluto pipeline, it was absolutely phenomenal. The amount of work that was going on the beaches, men going ashore to see how the Germans, what the Germans have been constructing on the beaches and whether it had changed. The whole weather forecast stuff as well. Absolutely unbelievable. And I don't know if you know that Dwight Eisenhower actually, because of poor weather, postponed D-Day. And he postponed it by 24 hours. And basically, if the weather hadn't changed, D-Day would have been off. And the weather forecaster basically said, the chief meteorologist said that there was going to be a window of opportunity on the 6th of June. Couldn't guarantee. And Eisenhower said, what are the chances of it being okay enough to launch a landing? And he said 50-50. And you think about the enormity of that for Dwight Eisenhower, to think, 50-50. Most of the time, if we were given those sort of odds for a lot of the decisions we make in life, a lot smaller than D-Day, we probably would err on the side of caution. But he had to make those decisions. So I found the whole D-Day thing, the build-up, absolutely fascinating. And of course, great stories of the battles and that themselves. And my uncle actually went on shore on D-Day +2, +3. And he never talked about it till just a few years before he died. He shared it with my cousin, and some phenomenal stories. Uncle Alf she's about 20 when he went ashore. And some of the things he saw and things that happened to him, he was actually fired on. They were in a truck, and it was fired on by a German tank. This German tank came out of nowhere coming for them, and they jumped out. And he literally, as he jumped out, the officer behind jumped behind him and was hit straight through the head by a round from the tank. So, some phenomenal stories. And I know a lot of you say that you know people, when I do all different videos, who just didn't speak, especially my recent talks about the Battle of Kohima and also the bridge on the River Kwai, and how a lot of veterans from the Far East never talked about what they experienced in the Burmese jungle or in prison camps. And I can understand why, but in one respect, also very sad that we don't know those stories. And I guess maybe from a therapeutic point of view, maybe if they talked about them, maybe they wouldn't have had some of the ghosts that haunted them, for some of them, for all their lives. Anyway, let me just have a quick look where we're at. Portsmouth, QA Library, absolutely, Portsmouth, key part. There's just on, excuse me, D-Day, I was down in Dartmouth a year ago, And Dartmouth, one of the big centres for the sending the boats out to across the Channel. And they actually said just before D-Day, you could walk from one side of the River Dart to the other without getting your feet wet. You just jump from boat to boat to boat. There were that many of them in the Dart estuary at Dartmouth. Thank you. And now I've got you all going in with different stories about D-Day plus. Yeah, thank you very much. Have I given any thoughts to covering the JFK assassinations? Oh, good one. No, I hadn't, is the straight answer, but now you've got me thinking. I do try and concentrate on British history, and it's only just, I was talking to someone in Australia this week about this. It's only to give myself some sort of parameters, because you can tell I go rambling just with British history. Can you imagine if I could go off down all sorts of stuff and if I'm into JFK, I'll probably be into Charles de Gaulle and things like that, and of course the assassination attempts on him and the whole Algeria battle, the Battle of Algiers and things in French history in the 1950s, which were phenomenal. Some great stories there about the Foreign Legion as well. Well, great if you like the French and the Foreign Legion. I guess if you're an Algerian, you don't think it's so blinking good, do you? History, all about perspectives, isn't it? One last thing I should just say, I had a great chat with two people in Australia this week. Alex bought an hour with the history chap for his dad as a belated Father's Day present. And, it was great. Obviously, they paid me for my time. But there you go, an interesting option. Maybe I should offer that as a general thing, for those of either as a present or indeed for some of you guys when you're sick and tired of buying everyone else a present and you fancy treating yourselves. And we had a great chat about history generally. We had one of these, it was almost like a private chit chat, but we were on Zoom, so they were able to talk to me, and it was a 50-50 really, in time on air. We talked about the Taku forts and the Opium Wars as well. Interesting. Definitely a subject I'll come back to in the future. Right, come on, let's crack on with history that happened this week. Week commencing 12th of November, and we're going to run through as I always do, in a date order, or day order, should I say. So we're going backwards and forwards a little bit in history. So 12th of November, 1642, the Battle of Brentford. It's one of these tiny battles from the English Civil War. It was very early on in the English Civil War when the wind was definitely behind the king, King Charles I. They had defeated the parliamentarians. The first ever encounter was at Edge Hill in Warwickshire, not a million miles from Stratford upon Avon. It had been a royalist victory, and the royalists now marched on London. London was the capital, prestigious to, in wars, everyone wants to capture a capital. And it was also the hotbed, really, of parliamentary support. So if you took out London, apart from an economic and a strategic and a PR point of view, you're also conquering one of the main areas where there was a lot of discontent against the king. And the royalists' army marched towards London. They got to Brentford, which is in Middlesex. If you look on the map of Greater London, it's very much in Greater London now, but at the time it was well outside of London, of course. And there, a small parliamentary force tried to oppose them. The royalists outnumbered them about 2-1. Royalists were commanded by King Charles's nephew, a man called Prince Rupert. Prince Rupert would go on to be one of the main royalist and most successful royalist commanders during the Civil War. And at Brentford on the 12th of November, 1642, he brushed aside this small parliamentary force. The parliamentarians lost about 170 dead, about 400 captured. So, and off they went. And they continued to march towards London. And we're going to come to them in a moment again, all right? A few days later. Also on the 12th of November, 1715, the Battle of Preston, so-called Battle of Preston. It was actually a siege. It was during the First Jacobite Rebellion, where the Jacobites marched in from Scotland. They were supporters of the deposed King James II, the last Catholic monarch of Britain. Won't go into all of that because we have talked about it in the past, a little bit about the Glorious Revolution, William and Mary taking over the throne on behalf of the Protestant cause, James fleeing. Well, James's supporters, Jacobites, so called because James in Latin is Jacobus. So that's how the Jacobites got their name. And They invaded England. It was the first revolt of 1715. It really it petered out reasonably quickly. And at Preston, it was the so-called Battle of Preston, or a siege. And still, technically, some people claim it's the last battle in England. Others will say just up the road, a couple of days later, Clifton Moor was the last battle. Most historians, military historians, will accept that actually the last battle on English soil, or certainly full-scale battle on English soil, happened at Sedgemoor about 30 years prior to this, when the Duke of Monmouth tried to oust James II. It's great how history changes, isn't it? Now James is trying to oust his successors. I'm just going to love this. Sorry, here, Black Prince, you love Jacobite history. I find it absolutely fascinating. It's not something I ever studied at school or at university, but the older you get, the more. Meanwhile, Lord Lansdowne, down with King James. Oh, God, we've got a battle going on now in our comment section. Is my speakers crackling, or the history chap's sound input has an issue? Don't know. I'm just doing it on my laptop speakers here. So I'm not sure if anyone else is having an issue. Don't know. Didn't have any issues last week. How much do you believe the French and Indian wars influenced the British light infantry tactics? Don't know is the answer to that. Someone's joining from France. Sedgemoor will be a good video. Yeah. And David is saying morning from Spain. I will do the Battle of Sedgemoor because I think it's a really good story. There's so many twists and turns, both in the build-up. The battle itself was, it wasn't a major one. It's like some of those battles in the English Civil War and indeed in the American Wars of Independence, where they built up to be major battles, but in many respects they weren't that big. The fallout from Sedgemoor was huge. And the fallout, of course, from Sedgemoor was that many of the men who had joined the Duke of Monmouth's Protestant rebellious army were shipped off to Barbados in chains to work on the sugar plantations. So, there's some interesting twists and turns. Just looking here. Jim, you enjoyed the video about the Malaysian emergency. Thank you very much. David Duffy, you love my stuff from Zulu Wars. Pinky, can I also do one on the Wars of the Roses? I have done some on the Wars of the Roses. If you look back in my in the back catalogue on the channel, I've got the Wars of the Roses explained, and I've done the battles of Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury, and Bosworth Field. So I've done a fair few of them. I have in the past actually done a mini-series all about the Wars of the Roses. So rather than just the battles, actually what the heck was going on in the Wars of the Roses. And I'm probably going to re-release that next year. So if you sign up onto my for my newsletter, which is on thehistorychap.com, details below, if I re-release that, then you'll get access to that, or you get the opportunity to get access to that. Good morning from California. Good to see you on the West Coast. Dingus Buck, does British democracy involve sticking a flag in a foreign land and telling the people, do what we say from now on? I'll let other people answer that one, Dingus. Right. Meanwhile, let's get back to what happened this week in British history. So, Dingus, you're going to have to bear with me on this one, won't you? Because you're going to know about stuff that happened in British history, not what we're doing elsewhere in the world all the time. So, back in 13th of November, 1002, so we're going back over 1,000 years, the St. Brice's Day Massacre. It's a bit like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, but without the mafia involvement, okay? Dingus, it's a fair question, I reckon. Yeah, but everyone else is putting fair questions in as well. If you don't like the fact, then please, by all means, you either can enjoy watching it or find something else to do with your time. St. Brice's Day Massacre. We are back in the reign of the Anglo-Saxons. It's the reign of Ethelred the Unready, as he was called. And he basically had an ongoing fight with Anglo-Saxon, had an ongoing fight with the Vikings or Scandinavians for the best part of 200 years. And in 1002, Ethelred decided he would eliminate all the Vikings living, or Danes living in England, in his realm. And he ordered a massacre of all the Danes. Didn't go fantastically well. Many of them were in areas which were fundamentally Dane controlled, so they were safe. And it went even worse because one of the King of Denmark's relatives was supposedly massacred by Ethelred. So rather than eliminating the Danish threat, he now had poked a bear with a stick, and the Danes came back under their king, Svein Forkbeard, and Svein Forkbeard fundamentally ousted Ethelred from his throne. So St. Brice's Day massacre, lots of archaeological evidence around that as well. That they have found bodies which have been literally butchered, like mass graves. St. Brice's Day massacre, and as I said, I get fascinated by Anglo-Saxon history. And is it interesting? There you have a mass grave with people who've been executed, and that still happens to this day elsewhere in the world. History does repeat itself, like one of my old professors at uni said. 13th of November, 1642, the Battle of Turnham Green. I just said just now, on the 12th, the Royalists had a victory at Brentford. Well, they continued their march on London during the English Civil War. A day later, they met a much bigger parliamentary force at Turnham Green, again in between Brentford and London. And this time the tables were reversed. This time it was the Royalists who were outnumbered 2-1 by the Earl of Essex and the Parliamentarian Army, in particular formed by the London trained bands. The London trained bands were, if I could give a modern analogy, they were sort of like the Territorial Army or the Reserve. Okay, so these were trained men in London who did a form of military service to potentially protect England against invasion, etc., normally from a Catholic power, and like Spain and people like that during the Spanish Armada. So the trained bands weren't the elite fighting forces, but they were a lot better than some of the men who turned up at Edgehill and Turnham and Brentford the few days before. And basically, it was this time, it was the parliamentarians sort of gained a victory. The victory, as much as anything, was the fact that the Royalists couldn't get past them. And the Royalists were forced to retire for the winter, because we're now in November, forced to retire for the winter in Oxford, and London was saved at that initial thing. And of course, London was never captured by the Royalists. So Battle of Turnham Green. 14th of November, 1883, something completely different. Robert Louis Stevenson published Treasure Island. Great story, and I'm sure there's at least one of you who is now doing a Jim Ladd sort of pirate voice in your head, if not to the screen. Pirates, really interesting subject, and another one I would love to cover in more detail at some stage. Doesn't really fit in with General Gordon and the Mahdi or the Zulu Wars or some of my recent stuff about Malaya or the Second World War. But I find pirates and also the story of highwaymen in England really interesting, and some great stories. And actually, pirates, massive, really interesting sort of area. I'm just being told YouTube's flashing up to me here saying ads are going to run for some viewers in 46 seconds time. So brace yourselves. Some of you might get them, some of you might not. Nothing to do with me, I'm afraid. Is it true that Oxford University is older than the Aztecs? Ooh, interesting. Not 100% sure on that one. I would have thought the Aztec civilization was older than Oxford University. But I do have something in a moment, right at the end, which is an interesting aside. Attack of the Ags. Dingus, you're saying Robert the Bruce and the Web. The Spider's Web. Don't know if you're interested in Robert the Bruce. Interestingly, we have a tie with Robert the Bruce this week, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. So we had... another thing from social history, 14th of November, 1908. First woman ever elected mayor of a town in Britain. So we're talking just over 100 years ago, quite amazing. A lady called Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, she was elected the mayor of Aldborough in Suffolk. Aldborough, a very nice coastal town. Interestingly, she'd already appeared in history. She'd already had a place in history. She was the first woman to ever become a qualified doctor or get a medical degree in England. But anyway, she became the first ever mayor of female mayor of a town. And 2 years later, she was still the mayor. and she proclaimed on the steps, as mayors certainly did in those days, not sure if we still do now, but that she proclaimed King George V as King of England after his father died, Edward VII. And the mayor comes out and sort of reads a note, and that happened all over the country. And she holds the record, therefore, for the first female to officially proclaim a king or monarch in England as well. So she didn't do badly, did she? Blimey. I mean, she was like one of those people that you see who, gathers everything to herself. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, interesting person. She also, in her 70s, stormed Parliament with some suffragettes. So she was a woman who knew what she wanted. Let's put it that way. And the two more on the 14th of November, 1918, 14th of November, 1918. The German forces in East Africa surrender. Great story, and I am going to come and do the whole East Africa campaign at some stage because it's fascinating. And we had General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck was the commander of the German forces. Germany had a colony in East Africa, which is now Tanzania. It was invaded. First off, he actually held the first invasion off by Indian troops. Then an Allied force arrived. It ended up being commanded by Jan Smuts, South African, former Boer War general, future member of the Imperial Cabinet in the Second World War, one of Churchill's confidants in the Second World War, Jan Smuts. And the Germans were pushed back. Eventually, they ended up fighting a guerrilla campaign. They crossed over into the Portuguese colony of Mozambique. And eventually, they circled around almost like a big U into what's now modern-day Zambia, northern Rhodesia at the time. Obviously, they were in the bush. Everyone was trying to find them. On the 11th of November, 1918, the armistice was signed on the Western Front in France, and the First World War officially came to a close, or for at least it did for the Western powers. And unfortunately, no one knew where the hell Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck was in Germany. The Germans had lost complete contact with him. He didn't have any radios or anything like that. So he was wandering around the African bush, continuing to fight his war. The Allies, obviously by telegraph now, knew that the war was off, so they weren't actually chasing him now. And eventually, on the 14th of November, 1918, a local British magistrate rode in on a pony, with a white flag into Vorbeck's camp. They found out where it was and gave him the news that actually the war was now over. So technically, the German forces in Africa were the last Germans to surrender in the war or to stop fighting in the war. No fighting had actually taken place between the 11th and the 14th because they'd gone to ground. Interesting story, some great stories there. I'm going to cover them off in the future. Dingus, Boer War, Dutch word for farmer. Absolutely, because I won't go into the Boer War now. You're about to send me down a rabbit hole here. But right, Dingus, you're on a bloody roll. Why did Hess fly to Britain on his own? That is a great one. Who fancies me doing a bit of Rudolf Hess? It's not really Zulus or Boer War, but it is very interesting, isn't it? There you go. First World War, as I say, with the Germans in East Africa, fascinating. We had the basis of the film, The African Queen. That's based on some real historic events with a hell of a Hollywood twist, but they were there. It appears in the Young Indiana Jones, the war in East Africa. Sort of briefly is mentioned in Out of Africa, the film. If you remember, Karen von Blixen takes supplies to the troops, and fascinating. In particular, fascinating that there was a particular battalion, the Frontier Battalion of the Fusiliers, and who were called the Old and the Bold. It was basically a scratch battalion. It was made up of people who fancied fighting the Germans, who had a bit of Africa experience. And it was made up of people up into their 60s, which, when you consider most of the British Army was under 30. We had these people like Fred Selous, who I've done a video on. And there was a lion tamer from a circus. There was former French Foreign Legionnaires, someone who'd been in the Antarctic. Fascinating story. And I think The Old and the Bold is another one that I will tell at some stage. I'm just going to be careful it doesn't become too niche a subject, because YouTube don't like me going too niche. That's the classic, isn't it? They don't reward you for being niche. But it's a great story, so I'd love to tell it if we possibly can. Oh, and finally, 14th. So 14th of November, we've had Treasure Island, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the Germans in East Africa. 14th of November, 1940, the Coventry Blitz. So this is where the famous Blitz on Coventry, the German raid on the Midlands city, small city of Coventry, a major car manufacturing city, was and continued to be after the war, famous for its cars. Obviously, the Germans saw it as a legitimate target to attack because it was helping the British war effort by producing vehicles. And in the night of the 14th, 15th of November, 500 tons of high explosives were dumped on Coventry. 30,000 incendiary bombs descended on the town. 500 people were killed, but 43,000 buildings were damaged. 43,000 buildings damaged, including, of course, most famously, the cathedral, which was burnt out. And a new cathedral after the war was built alongside the old cathedral. Certainly, I've read reports. I'm not sure if it was in the great series, The World at War. Could have been. But there were witnesses who said that they could see the orange glow of Coventry from Birmingham. In fact, they were sending fire brigade from Birmingham to Coventry because the fires were so intense in Coventry at the time. Yeah, different time. But anyway, there you go. Coventry Blitz. And it tended to be used by the British as a defense mechanism, in the sense every time we bombed a German city, it's like, look what they did to Coventry, which is fine. And Davey's saying the comparison between the old and the new cathedrals is stark in Coventry. Yes, absolutely. Coventry, the modern Coventry Cathedral, is very much almost a creature of the 1960s, a statement of the 1960s. Yeah, you either like it or you don't. I'm sort of middle of the ground. Funny enough, my dad was a construction engineer. He was on that project as a manager, the Coventry junior manager, but he was on that particular project in the 1960s. Well worth visiting. Coventry actually hasn't got a lot of its old historic heart left because it was all bombed. There are some really quaint buildings in the centre of Coventry, not far from the cathedral, which really would almost be, well, they are Warwickshire style, so very much like what you see in Stratford upon Avon. Obviously, you have to negotiate the ring road. Anyone who knows Coventry, what's the ring road like? Is it hell or is it hell? But again, that's part of history and the story of Coventry. 15th of November, 1899, Winston Churchill is captured by the Boers. Someone mentioned the Boer War earlier. Someone was talking about Boers. Churchill was there. He was a journalist, and he was on a train, an armoured train in what's now KwaZulu-Natal, Natal colony at the time, up near Ladysmith, the siege of Ladysmith. And he was in this armoured car, which got ambushed, armoured train, which was ambushed by the Boers. The train was, one of the carriages was derailed, and Winston Churchill, the journalist, basically took command of both the defence and then trying to couple the carriage back onto the train. He was armed with a revolver, which is an interesting thing. I don't think Jeremy Bowen, currently covering the Israel-Palestine conflict for the BBC, carries a revolver on him. But anyway, Churchill was, and he was. Funny enough, he was captured by the Boers. And the Boers did two things. Number one, they said there is no way that a journalist should be taking command of British troops, trying to get the train recoupled and be armed with a revolver. So we're not buying your journalist, I'm innocent and neutral story. And number two, aren't you the Winston Churchill whose dad, Randolph Churchill, was the Chancellor of the Exchequer? You're quite a high-profile person. You're definitely going to be a prisoner. And he was shipped off to Pretoria, famously escaped. Bit of controversy over his escape, but he ended up getting back to British territory, and the publicity around that helped start his political career. He won a by-election shortly afterwards, and that was the beginning of a parliamentary career that lasted nearly 60 years. I've done a video about Winston Churchill and who actually captured him. Because interestingly, Churchill believed, as only Churchill would really, that he was captured personally, not by any old Boer, but by Louis Botha, the commander of the Boer forces in Natal, up and coming, one of the best generals the Boers had, and ultimately the first Prime Minister of South Africa. And he supposedly recites his story in one of his books, which I've got here, which is he was telling the story about his escape and his capture to a whole lot of Commonwealth or imperial leaders, including Botha sitting there. And Botha supposedly said, Don't you recognize me? I'm the man who captured you, which is a great story. Funny enough, no one's ever been able to corroborate it. And Louis Botha died shortly afterwards, so we don't know the story, so went with him. But interestingly, hello from the colonies, Australia. But interestingly, others claim he was captured by some Italians who were fighting for the Boers, which I guess doesn't sound quite as good as being captured by the main Boer general and future Prime Minister of South Africa, does it? So there you go. So have a look at that. I've got to put a link down below. I'm just watching the time and trying to keep inside the hour. 16th of November, 1857, the relief, or the second relief of Lucknow, Indian city, during the, well, what do you want to call it? The Indian Revolt of 1857 to 59. I know we've got some, I know we've got one or two folk here from India. In fact, you've just commented. But it's Indian Revolt. Some people call it the Sepoy Revolt. Other people call it the Indian Mutiny. Other people call it the First War of Independence in India. But nevertheless, whatever you call it, we had a rising against British rule in India in 1857. I've done several videos about that. I've put a link to the specific one about the Siege of Lucknow down below. Okay, but major revolt against British rule. It started with sepoys, Indian troops who were employed by the East India Company. Rapidly, other people got involved. Members of the population got involved. Various hereditary rulers were involved. It became a general rising against the British, not very well coordinated in most cases, and not throughout the whole of India. But in the north of India, it seriously shook British control. British were besieged in the town or city of Lucknow, and they sent one force to relieve it. That force managed to break through the siege, got into the city, and then ended up being besieged themselves. So now at a second siege of Lucknow. And on the 16th of November, 1857, General Sir Colin Campbell, he of fame from the Battle of Balaclava, who formed the Thin Red Line at the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War, General Sir Colin Campbell marched on Lucknow and relieved it. Interestingly, what he actually did was he relieved the garrison and then they withdrew. And Lucknow went over to the Indian rebels again. But anyway, so that's Colin Campbell, 16th of November, 1857, a relief of Lucknow. Link of it in the story below. 17th of November, we're nearly there, 17th of November, hooray, today. I've got a few for you here. First and foremost, I can't remember, someone mentioned Robert the Bruce. 1292, John Balliol was proclaimed King of Scotland. And it was fundamentally, John Balliol was Scottish. He was also a candidate supported by the English. He was, there was a power vacuum in Scotland, a succession crisis. Balliol was backed by the English and King Edward I of England, who was a pretty powerful king in his own right and a warrior. Great if you were English, not so great if you weren't, because he duffed in the Welsh and the Scots. He was backing John Balliol. Balliol's main opponent was Robert Bruce. And effectively, Scotland went into a civil war with a sort of Balliol supported by the English, Bruce supported by various Scottish, other Scots. As I say, it was a civil war. Interestingly, Bruce had a lot of English blood in him. So all these, I've talked in the past about national narratives and how we all like to take a particular line. And there's always a bit of grey on the edge of national narratives. But yeah, great story. Anyway, that's John Balliol. I'd like to come back to that at some stage in the future, because I think the English-Scottish wars are fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And, you know, for those of us who live in Britain, we've all got so much mixed blood. If you go back and do DNA tests and everything, you know, I mean, I know I've got Scottish blood because my grandmother was Scottish, but you know, I've got a massive bit of blood from DNA from northeast Scotland, from the McEwen clan, and northeast Scotland, the area where Macbeth came from. And he was a real character, by the way, not just a Shakespearean invention. Became King of Scotland, but earlier than this, just before the Norman conquest. 17th of November, 1558. Before I do that, let me just check what people are saying. I do beg your pardon. Anniversary of the Suez Canal opening. You're absolutely right, Frank. Sorry. Yes, Suez Canal opened. I can't remember which day, but it's one of the days this week. Was it today or tomorrow? I can't remember. Good morning to you, Bill, in Indiana. good to see you with us. I've still got a coffee. It's starting to get pretty cold now. Do you like my D-Day mug, by the way? It's we've got everyone's involved in that one, didn't we? So we've, there's a nod to everyone, but maybe not some of the other people like the Dutch Navy and people who are also involved in some of the Polish regiments and things. But anyway, that's another story. Edward I also went on crusade and was nearly killed by an assassin with a poisoned dagger. He's an interesting character. Seriously, you didn't want to cross Edward I. No. And what made it even funnier was that his son was the exact opposite. And of course, it was his son who was absolutely trounced by Robert Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn, whereas his father had a significant victory over the Scots and William Wallace, Braveheart, at the Battle of Falkirk. So it's amazing how, history does twist and turn all the time. And certainly in those days, personalities had a huge part to play. And Edward II was the complete opposite of his father. So there you go. Good day from Perth in Western Australia. Nice to see you, Perth. I used to live in Cheshire before I moved down to Worcester, in a village called Bunbury. And I believe there is a Bunbury in Western Australia, not far from Perth. So there you go. I think they're twinned. I'm not sure. But yeah, we certainly, in Bunbury Village Hall, there was a boomerang and a flag from Bunbury in Western Australia. There you go. Edward I rules. Well, he certainly did. And you certainly didn't want to oppose him, did you? Right. 17th of November. Let's talk another royal here for a minute, a royal bit in Britain. 17th of November, 1558, Mary I died. Mary I, probably better known as Bloody Mary, Catholic monarch, the eldest child of Henry VIII, from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She stayed Catholic when Henry decided to break with Rome. She had a brief reign, very unhappy woman in many ways. And if you actually look at her upbringing, you would probably say that she was psychologically damaged. I'm not a psychologist, but if someone presented me with someone like that when I used to be a magistrate in court, you'd have said I could see some of the problems coming just by reading the case, the family history. So that's another life I used to have once as well, being a magistrate. But anyway, 1558, she was the first woman to ever be queen in her own right in English history. But it's funny to say she's remembered much more as Bloody Mary, the woman who burnt Protestants at the stake, which is a bit unfair because her father, Henry VIII, was a darn sight more bloody ruler and despotic ruler than she was. But there you go. She was succeeded by her half-sister, Queen Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And it's the only time, get this, it's the only time in British history, so we're talking, well, yeah, and I'll take in Northern Ireland in UK history as well, okay? But from the British Isles, it's the only time that the crown has passed from a woman to a woman, ever. Didn't have any time for each other, particularly. And Mary I, really suspected Elizabeth of plotting against her at different stages. And I've actually put a video. Mary, short reign. She was actually opposed on several occasions, and she was opposed in a rebellion called Wyatt's Rebellion, which resulted in a major battle in London called the Battle of Fleet Street. And I've put a description of that. It's only a 10-minute video. It's done right at the very beginning of History Chap days. Okay, so it's not as good as my current videos in the sense that there's probably a lot more of me talking to camera and far less visuals. But yeah, it's an interesting one, and you're only going to put up with me 10 minutes. So there you go. Right, so that's Mary I dying on 1558. 17th of November, 1834, Duke of Wellington becomes Prime Minister of Great Britain for the second time. We all know him really as the Victor of Waterloo. Those of you who are into Richard Sharp novels will know, obviously, he's the victor in the Peninsular Wars. Obviously, he had a history in India as well. He really cut his teeth in India, and of course, it's interesting. He came back from India as a bit of a rising star, and it was on his return from India that he was waiting in the government offices in London, and he met Nelson, Admiral Nelson. Nelson was the big hero of the day, and he was the Wellington was the up and coming. It wasn't Wellington at that stage. He was just General Wellesley, And Nelson talked all about himself, wasn't interested whatsoever in Wellington, talked all about himself. And Nelson did have a heck of an ego. He left the room, and someone obviously told Nelson, he probably said, who was that chap I was speaking to in there? And they said, oh, that was General Wellesley. He's just, he's just won quite a few significant victories against the Marathas in India. And Nelson came back into the room, and Wellington said it was a completely different Nelson. That Nelson asked him questions, they talked strategy, and Nelson said it was one of the most, Wellington said it was one of the most enlightening and memorable conversations he ever had in his life. Interesting, isn't it? Nelson, Admiral Nelson, a man who was able to turn the charm when he wanted to. Anyway, Duke of Wellington became a British Prime Minister, and he served twice. This was the second time in 1834. His second premiership lasted 23 days. Sort of a bit like Liz Truss, really, except Liz Truss never won the Battle of Waterloo, did she? Speaking of Waterloo, who is up for the new film Napoleon, the Ridley Scott film? I'm really looking forward to seeing it. It's coming out in the UK next Thursday, 22nd. Oh, is that Wednesday? Wednesday, beg your pardon, 22nd. Would you believe I've got a YouTube creators conference that night in Birmingham, because I wanted to go and see it on the opening night, because then I could talk to you guys. But hopefully I'm going to see it next Thursday. So I'll be talking to you next Friday about it and my impressions. Ridley Scott always, I think he's done some great films, including Gladiator, of course, the opening of the battle scene against the Germans in Gladiator. Awesome. And interestingly, in that battle scene, I don't know if you're aware of this, you hear the Germans before you see them, and you can hear their battle cries, the chants. And if ever you've watched Gladiator and thought, I'm sure I've heard those chants somewhere before, they were lifted from the film Zulu. Ridley Scott loved Zulu, and he actually used the Zulu battle cries at Rorke's Drift in the film Zulu, and he lifted them and he used them in Gladiator. There you go. Got me thinking this morning. Here's one for the comments. Get yourselves ready on the typewriter. Okay. Zulus against Romans. Who would have won? Off we go. Come on, who's going to be the first one to give me a view? Zulus or Romans? Who would win a battle? Hammer down under. Romans. Okay. Romans. Pinky's gone for the Romans. Romans. Oh, that's a useful one. Everyone, oh, thank you, Black Prince. You've thrown in a Zulu. Well done. Yeah, I was thinking about this because it's the sort of thing I think about when I'm brushing my teeth. And my heart says I'd like the Zulus to win. But I think my head says probably the Romans. And I only say probably because the Romans would have been armed, normally would have had cavalry and artillery, Roman style artillery. So I think they technologically would have still been able to outdo the Zulus. Man for man? Well, the Zulus proved that man for man against the British and against the Boers, they were more than a match. But if you brought the Roman technology in, I'm reckoning it's a Roman victory. But terrain a major factor, says Hammer down under. Yes, it would be. Yeah. The Zulus had rifles. Very good twist there. Thank you very much, expat. Yes, if the Zulus had their rifles, which they did possess, even at Isandlwana and indeed at Rorke's Drift, could they have made an impact on the Romans? Rather depends. And don't forget, the Romans were defeated on many occasions, not least by the barbarians or the Germans in Germany. Right. So that was that. Speaking of Africa, last one for the 17th of November, 1855. David Livingstone reached the Victoria Falls. Wouldn't mind doing some stories about the explorers from the Victorian period, and David Livingstone I think would be fascinating. A lot of you have asked as well for Ernest Shackleton, preferably, several of you said, not the famous expedition where they got stranded and he had to cross the ocean, but how about his first expedition where he nearly got to the pole? And for several years, he was able to dine out. Ernest Shackleton was the man who had got to closest to the pole. And I think he was delivering a series of lectures about being that close to the pole in Germany when news got through that Amundsen had got to the pole. And that was the end of his dining out experiences. But a fascinating man actually. And where I was brought up in Hertfordshire, there was a grave to someone who was on Scott's Robert Scott's Falcon Scott's expedition to the South Pole. Didn't actually go to the pole itself. He was on a secondary expedition along the coast. A man called Cherry Garrard. Cherry Garrard, and and he wrote a book which I've got up here somewhere. And of course, naturally, I won't be able to find it when I'm looking for it. Oh, blinking out! No, can't see it for love or money. It's bound to be here somewhere. But all about his time. Oh, there it is, Cherry Garrard. And it's all about his time in the Antarctic. So maybe some Antarctic explorers or and some of the African explorers might be something to do, just as a bit of a difference, but a bit of a nod to 19th century Britain and the characters that 19th century Britain produced. It's a fascinating period. It's not all just about the battles, but you can tell I end up in them. But I find the 19th century, I always find if you go around places like Birmingham and you look at all the buildings and you realize just how much effort went into some of those buildings to make them and to make the sculptures on the outsides. And there they are, 150 years later, 140 years later. And you do wonder whether some of the great marvels of our current era, office blocks and that have been built, are going to last 140 years. And then you look at, our railway system, some of the brilliant railway stations in London, even the much maligned London sewage system was all Victorian. And they did things like Tower Bridge, and an amazing group of people, huge amount of self-confidence. Which maybe we don't have. We certainly don't have it in the same. It's certainly not manifested in the same way now. Anyway, so that was a ramble about the Victorians. So just bring me on to the last bit. Okay, last thing this week in British history: 18th of November, tomorrow, 1267. Back into the Middle Ages, medieval time. The Statute of Marlborough. And you're probably sitting there thinking, the Statute of Marlborough. It is the oldest piece of legislation still on the statute books in Britain. 756-year-old laws, which are still, some of them are still in place now. That's pretty cool, isn't it? Do you realize, I was sitting there thinking, this is one for all my American friends and indeed for the folk down in Australia as well, okay? That by the time Jamestown was set up on the east coast of America, okay, these statutes had been in law in Britain longer than the United States has been in existence. And they're still going strong now. Basically, it was all about debt and how people could recover debts. There were 29 chapters, 4 of which are still on the statute book. A little bit twists and turns. Fundamentally, you can only expect for people who don't repay their debts, you can only have a reasonable punishment. Seems fair now. Obviously, at the time, up until the statutes, it was a little bit like the Wild West. You could probably be strung up for not repaying, your 2 shilling bet or whatever. Another interesting one, just within that, you cannot seek revenge for non-payment of debts without the authority of a court. Now that seems quite normal, but then it was groundbreaking. And you can't reclaim a debt by stopping someone on the King's Highway. So you can't just intercept them. You've got to have the authority of the court. The final one that's still in place now, and probably is actually as pertinent in the others, is that tenants can't ruin or sell land that they're tenanted on. So, we see that now. You can't smash up a property if you rent it. You can't sublet it. You can't decide that, you're renting a house or an office block and sell off the garden to someone else. It's not yours to sell. Actually went into the statute book back on the 18th of November, 1267, 756 years ago. Just 30 years after the very first English Parliament. And actually before the Magna Carta got onto the statute book. So there you go. Interesting how history still has relevance today, all in different ways. But even history from 750 plus years ago is still relevant today. So there you go. Hope you like that. A little bit of week in British history. Are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? Great quote from Charles Dickens. Well, not from Charles Dickens, but from Christmas Carol, Old Scrooge. So coming up, I mean, a general question actually, and I'll ask you, again, if you can type in, I'll be very grateful for your responses. I've tended to do a lot of military stuff, okay, in the past on my videos, and it's a general question. Would you like me to continue really focusing on the military stuff, or would you like me to be going into more wider British history, like the kings and queens and stuff like that, okay? And the highwaymen and the pirates and stuff like that. I'd be really interested. And there's a secondary question, which you can all dump in here, okay? Again, I seem to have found a specialism in the 19th century. And I'd love to keep doing the 19th century for you. But would you like more stuff from the 20th century? And indeed, would you like stuff from previous periods? And I know for a lot of you, the answer is yes, all of it, please. But I'm just trying to get a steer because, quite frankly, I'm running out of time here, and I get dragged and pulled in so many different directions. So just like a bit of a steer from you as to, where should I be focusing my time? Military, not military, 19th century, 20th century, pre-19th century. So, your Jacobites and medievals and Anglo-Saxons and Romans, all that sort of stuff. Don't know. Happy, let's just say, play to your strengths, says Davey. Thank you very much, mate. British explorers, military is, if it's a niche, seldom explored. Thank you. Industrial archaeology, very insightful. Thank you for that. That's maybe it have to be Victorian industrial archaeology, because otherwise we'd be going all over the show. Oh, the Bhagavad Gita. Yeah, thank you very much for that from India. Yeah, there is stuff very much from the past that's still very much. Irish War of Independence would be nice. Actually, the whole history of Ireland and its relationship with, well, I was going to say with Britain, but it's principally with England, would be fascinating, wouldn't it? And a lot of people don't know that story in Britain. If I'm really honest, if you said to most people, what's the Irish, British Irish, apart from the IRA, and when they talk about the IRA, they're talking very much about 1970s onwards IRA. Most British people don't know very much, and yet it is a massive defining thing. If I speak to my Irish friends, they will most certainly have an opinion, and they will have coloured opinions too about British rule. They were, again, certain national narratives in Ireland that big up certain events and certain people, play down other things. Yeah, that's it. Pirates, please, someone says. Military primarily. Duke of Marlborough would be interesting. Yeah. Yes, we'd love Jacobite content, especially 1745. I'm Ireland. So, I mean, you're in Ireland, Keith. Irish history. Oh Lord. Oh God. I was going to do Gallipoli at some stage. That would get the Aussies and Kiwis going, won't it? Especially the Aussies. Ireland. Yeah. I might as well just bring it on. Just slag me off in the comments, everyone. I'm doing Irish history now. So people are saying actually there's bits everywhere. Okay, that's really handy. Thank you very much. It's good just to know, because you've taken the time out to listen to me. You're what I would call sort of my fans, because quite frankly, if you've sat here, if you really dislike Chris Green talking to you on a camera, you wouldn't have been here for 50 minutes, would you? So okay, thank you very much for that. Fair bit of stuff coming up. Hoping to get I'm going to be doing one on Waterloo, bit of military, and Battle of Jutland. 20th century, but loads of you asked about Battle of Jutland, and I'm going to talk about the second youngest BC winner who was at the Battle of Jutland. Want to touch on Cecil Rhodes as well. That's another one, isn't it? Someone said to me recently, and I won't say who they are, but they are a YouTube producer, and they said, what I love about you, Chris, is you go to the places I wouldn't dare go to. And and they mentioned the Indian revolt being one of them. And I mean, I want to do the Opium Wars at some stage, which again, I'm sure some Chinese people will have a definite view on the British involvement in the Opium Wars. Also want to do 55 Days in Peking, the Boxer Rising. That might be a good one to do as well. So there you go. And if you haven't, please have a look at my latest video, which on the Malayan emergency, sort of from the tail end of the British Empire, where the British were opposed by a communist rising in Malaya. And yeah, there's some similarities with Vietnam, plenty that aren't, but it was a successful outcome. And what's really interesting is it was a Commonwealth outcome as well. It was Malay troops, British troops, but there were people there from New Zealand, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Canada were in there for a bit, and we had people from Kenya and also Rhodesia and Nyasaland, including, of course, C Squadron of the SAS, who were recruited, 100 of them from, as it was then, Rhodesia, many of whom went on to fight in the guerrilla war, a bush war in the 1970s in Rhodesia. So there you go. Have a great weekend. Thanks for joining me. We're on the hour. It's time to clear off, let you get on with your days. Thank you ever so much for all of your support. And I look forward to seeing you next Friday. See you soon. Bye.